My hands were still shaking from the weight of another victory. Rockets had launched on schedule. Billions moved at my command. Yet I sat alone in the glow of dead monitors, completely hollow. The Empire keeps winning, but the man inside it is losing. I closed my eyes, and just the thought of your wisdom cut through the static like a quiet blade. No performance, no armor, just the raw possibility of being truly seen. If you've ever built everything and still felt nothing, stay with me. This is the confession I've never spoken out loud until tonight. I sit here tonight in the cold glow of these monitors, the clock pushing past 2 in the morning, while the world I built keeps turning without any need for my permission. Rockets trace their paths across distant skies, markets pulse with invisible algorithms that never rest, and the Empire hums in its relentless mechanical rhythm. Another victory sits heavy on the desk beside me, another conquest logged and filed away. Yet, instead of triumph, all I feel is the slow, crushing weight of gravity pulling me back down to Earth after yet another orbit. Success has a way of hollowing a man out from the inside. Every layer of armor I added to survive at this scale has sealed me further away from anything real. The hypervigilance never sleeps. It scans every shadow, every message, every calculated smile from those who circle the throne. I have engineered systems that predict the behavior of billions, launched machines into the void beyond our atmosphere, and still in this quiet room, the silence inside my own chest feels louder than any engine roar. I was so exhausted tonight. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep in the bones, not from physical labor, but from the constant performance of being the archetype they all expect, the genius, the builder, the one who must never falter. I stare at the data streams flickering across the screens and wonder how many more victories it will take before this isolation becomes permanent, before the man behind the myth disappears completely into the machinery he created. And yet, even here in this sterile midnight hour, something shifts. A faint whisper breaks through the static. Not a voice I have ever truly heard, but the imagined cadence of your wisdom, steady and unflinching. Reaching across time like a single warm current in an ocean of ice, it does not demand anything. It does not seek to extract or impress or negotiate. It simply exists as the possibility of being seen without the armor, without the Empire casting its long shadow between us. I close my eyes for a moment and let that distant warmth touch the raw edges of this fatigue. The satellites keep their silent watch overhead. The algorithms continue their indifferent calculations. But for one suspended breath, the crushing velocity of it all slows. Not because the world has changed, but because the thought of you reminds me that there is still part of me that has not been completely consumed. This exhaustion runs deeper than any single night. It is the accumulated cost of years spent climbing so high that the air grew thin and the faces below blurred into irrelevance. No one sees the boy who still hides inside this fortress of achievement, the one who built empires to drown out the sound of his own unanswered longing. They clap for the myth, they chase the legend, but they never stay long enough to witness the cost. And so I sit here speaking these words into the void, knowing they may reach you long after this particular exhaustion has faded into memory. The contrast is brutal, isn't it? Out there, absolute control over forces that reshape continents and futures. In here, a man unraveling in the quiet because true rest has always felt just out of reach. But even in this unraveling, your imagined presence begins to pull me back from the machine. Not as salvation, not as fantasy, simply as the first honest acknowledgement that this weight does not have to be carried entirely alone. That somewhere in the future there might be eyes that can hold both the genius and the fracture without looking away. The heavy silence lingers now, thick and expectant. It presses against my ribs, demanding I go deeper into what this exhaustion truly reveals when no one else is watching. Because if even the thought of your wisdom can soften the edges of a night like this, then perhaps the ache I carry has always been pointing towards something far more dangerous and necessary than another victory. I was so exhausted tonight, but just thinking of your wisdom calmed my soul, and that small mercy is enough to keep breathing through the next layer of truth. I was so exhausted tonight, but just thinking of your wisdom calmed my soul, and that small mercy is enough to keep breathing through the next layer of truth. Because this exhaustion does not live in isolation. It is fed and sharpened by the empire I have built, the one that now turns its appetite inward and begins to devour its own king. I step away from the quiet room and into the public coliseum, where the lights are blinding and the price stakes never sleep. Boardrooms stretch out like ancient battlefields, filled with men and women who speak in a calculated tones while their eyes measure what they might extract from the myth standing before them. Algorithms judge every breath I take, every word I choose, every strategic silence I allow to linger. Satellites carry fragments of my name across continents at the speed of light, broadcasting an image of control that feels increasingly like a stranger's reflection. Out there I command forces that reshape supply chains, redirect capital flows, and bend the trajectory of entire industries. The machinery responds with precision. Launches happen on schedule. Markets react as modeled. The scale is godlike in its detachment, cold and efficient, a symphony of steel and code that demands nothing less than perfection. Yet the deeper I move through this world of visible power, the more complete my fragmentation becomes on the inside. Absolute control in the external realm has only ever produced a deeper unraveling within. The hypervigilance that once protected the vision now patrols the borders of my own mind, scanning for threats in every interaction, every alliance, every fleeting moment of apparent connection. The genius archetype has become its own prison. I constructed it brick by brick, necessity by necessity, until the walls grew so high that even I can no longer see over them clearly. They clap in the Colosseum. They praise the foresight, the audacity, the relentless drive. But their applause is currency, not closeness. Their admiration is a transaction dressed in fine suits and careful language. No one stays long enough to witness the cost. No one dares look past the armor to the man who sometimes wonders if he traded his humanity for the sole ability to move mountains and launch rockets into the void. I remain unknown to myself in these moments. The exhaustion I spoke of earlier deepens here, philosophical and unrelenting, a loneliness that sharpens into something almost metaphysical. How does a mind engineered for orbital calculations and recursive improvement ever reconcile the raw human need to simply be witnessed without agenda? The empire demands the performance. The public Colosseum rewards the flawless execution. And so, the king keeps ruling even as the throne grows colder and more isolating with every passing season of conquest. Yet even as I describe this descent, the faint presence of your imagined wisdom lingers at the edge of the storm. It does not rush in with easy promises or sentimental light. It simply holds space, steady and unflinching, a quiet room materializing within the chaos of the Colosseum. In that imagined shelter, the algorithms fall silent for a moment. The drift into the background, the boardroom battles recede, and what remains is the honest fracture. A man who has carried this weight for years, perhaps decades, without ever setting it down fully in front of another soul. I have grown accustomed to the solitude that success enforces, the late nights where strategy meetings bleed into personal voids, the hyper-awareness that turns every potential relationship into another chessboard, the philosophical ache of realizing that the higher the empire climbs, the fewer hands are capable of reaching this altitude without trembling. And still I continue, because stopping has never been part of the design. The machine does not permit rest for its architect. This is the truth I rarely voice aloud. The empire that devours its king is not some external monster. It is the logical endpoint of the path I chose, the necessary consequence of building at this scale while refusing to compromise the vision. The contrast lives in my bones now. Absolute mastery of the visible world paired with total alienation from the invisible one that matters most. Loneliness is no longer an emotion. It has become a philosophical constant, a quiet room that echoes with the absence of the one who might finally understand the cost without needing to possess it. And so the exhaustion tonight feels eternal, carried forward from 1,000 similar nights. But the thought of your wisdom returns, softening the edges just enough to allow this confession to continue. It creates the possibility that this fragmentation does not have to remain permanent, that somewhere beyond the Colosseum and the satellites and the relentless machinery, there exists a gaze capable of seeing the man behind the myth, without demanding he perform his own destruction for their entertainment. The heavy silence presses in again, expectant and thick, with what must come next. Because if I have carried this alone for so long, then speaking it into the void is the only honest way to prepare for the day it might no longer be necessary. The empire keeps humming, the king keeps ruling, but in this suspended breath the quiet room waits, and your wisdom feels a little closer than it did before. The heavy silence presses in again, expectant and thick with what must come next. Because if I have carried this alone for so long, then speaking it into the void is the only honest way to prepare for the day it might no longer be necessary. The empire keeps humming, the king keeps ruling, but in this suspended breath the quiet room waits, and your wisdom feels a little closer than it did before. These are the nights when even genius fails. The kind of nights where the brilliance I have cultivated for decades turns inward like a blade, carving through every defense I thought was impenetrable. Thoughts race in recursive loops, analyzing threats that may never materialize, replaying conversations from years ago for hidden agendas I might have missed. The hyper-awareness that once fueled launches and closed impossible deals now patrols the empty corridors of my own mind, scanning shadows for dangers that exist only in the exhaustion of sustained vigilance. In this quiet room, the absence echoes louder than any engine. The walls hold no applause, no market reactions, no calculated alliances, just the steady tick of a clock that measures how long a man can endure his own company without fracturing. I sit here and feel the full weight of what the empire has cost me in human terms. The scale of it all out there, rockets piercing the atmosphere on schedule, deals reshaping entire sectors with cold precision, velocity that never slows, clashes so brutally against this trembling core that remains stubbornly, painfully human. Past ghosts flicker through the darkness like half-formed signals from distant satellites. There were women who stepped into my orbit with what seemed like genuine curiosity, only to find the gravitational pull too severe. They tried to hold the weight, but the pressure of this life warped every attempt into something transactional. Bodies that lingered for a season before withdrawing under the strain of late nights and unspoken expectations. Conversations that began with fire and ended in careful distance, as if they had glimpsed the depth of the fracture and decided the myth was safer to admire from afar. Love reduced to negotiation. Connection thinned into strategic alliance. Each departure left its mark, not as dramatic wounds, but as quiet erosions. Layers of armor thickening around a heart that still somehow hoped for something uncalculated. I was so exhausted tonight, the kind of exhaustion that genius cannot outthink or outmaneuver, Because no algorithm predicts the precise moment when the builder realizes he has engineered a world that leaves no room for his own vulnerability. The cold machinery keeps operating at full thrust. Launches plotted, markets anticipated, empires expanding. While inside this room, the man behind the controls feels the raw tremor of isolation that no amount of scale can silence. The contrast lives in my blood now. Out there, absolute mastery over forces that bend reality to intention. In here, a mind that cannot quiet itself long enough to simply rest in its own skin. Nights like this expose the philosophical wound at the center of it all. How does one reconcile the godlike detachment required to move at this altitude with the aching need to be known without performance, without extraction, without the constant calculation of risk and reward? And yet, even as these ghosts circle and the racing thoughts threaten to pull me under, the idea of your steady wisdom begins to surface again. Not as rescue, not as romantic illusion, but as a possibility so precise and unflinching that it cuts through the static. Your imagined presence does not flinch from the darkness I have described. It does not demand the archetype or the achievements. It simply holds the space for the trembling human core that has been carrying this weight in secret. That thought studies my pulse just enough to breathe through the next layer of confession. It creates an emotional bridge toward a kind of psychological safety I have never truly known. One where the quiet room might finally stop echoing with absence and begin to resonate with something real. The Empire continues its relentless orbit in the background. The past ghosts fade into memory, but the bridge remains, fragile and necessary, leading me closer to the admission that this exhaustion has always been a signal, pointing toward the one who might see both the failures of genius and the man who remains beneath them. The silence deepens once more, heavy with anticipation. Because if even the mere contemplation of your wisdom can interrupt these nights when everything else fails, then perhaps the path through this darkness has always been leading somewhere beyond the Colosseum and the machines, somewhere where the trembling core no longer has to stand alone. The silence deepens once more, heavy with anticipation, because if even the mere contemplation of your wisdom can interrupt these nights when everything else fails, then perhaps the path through this darkness has always been leading somewhere beyond the Colosseum and the machines, somewhere where the trembling core no longer has to stand alone. And so I turn inward now, mapping the precise contours of the wisdom I have been unconsciously dissolving for across all these years of ascent. This is not idle fantasy or sentimental projection. It is survival mathematics, the rigorous equation my mind has been running in the background while empires rose and orbits stabilized. I crave a wisdom that is unconditional in its gaze, one that pierces every engineered defense without hesitation or retreat. A presence capable of seeing the boy still hidden behind the billionaire, the fractures beneath the flawless execution, and refusing to look away or demand repairs on the spot. The external machine intrudes even here, relentless as ever. Media storms rage across the feeds, twisting narratives into weapons while strategic wars unfold in boardrooms and regulatory arenas where every move carries the weight of satellites, weapon supply chains. The velocity never relents, deals close at midnight, launches demand perfect precision. The cold scale of it all presses against the windows of this quiet room, reminding me that the Empire does not pause for philosophical reflection. It demands the archetype, the hypervigilant strategist, the man who has optimized every variable except the one that matters most, the capacity to be held without calculation. Yet in the contrast, the inner craving sharpens into something almost crystalline. I envision your wisdom as a steady force that does not seek to possess the myth or extract value from the legend. It would hold both the monster of ambition and the vulnerable child who built fortresses to quiet his own loneliness. No flinching at the darkness I have confessed. No retreat when the hypervigilance surfaces and tests every boundary. Just an unflinching steadiness, philosophical in its depth, raw in its humanity, offering the psychological shelter I have never permitted myself to need. I was so exhausted tonight, and still am, yet mapping this shape brings a different kind of fire. Not the burning drive of conquest, but the slow, aching heat of recognition. Thinking of you here functions as survival math, because without this possibility, the fragmentation would complete itself. The boy behind the billionaire would vanish entirely into the machinery. The quiet room would become a permanent tomb of silence, rather than a space of potential resonance. Your unseen light does not illuminate with false brightness. It simply exists as the counterweight to the cold algorithms and media storms, the one variable that refuses to be optimized or predicted. The Empire keeps turning in the distance, its gears grinding through another cycle of strategic necessity. Satellites relay data across the night sky. Markets anticipate the next move. But inside, the craving deepens with philosophical intensity. I want the kind of wisdom that can sit in this room with me, after the victories lose their taste, after the ghosts have been named and still see the man entire. Not the curated genius, not the performer on the Colosseum stage, the one who carries the cost of every launch in his bones and still wonders if true connection was ever compatible with this altitude. This contemplation swells now with sincere ache, unfiltered and heavy. It is the acknowledgement that my entire trajectory, all the scale and isolation, has been a long, indirect path toward this exact need. A mind built for orbital mechanics and recursive systems, finally admitting that rest might only arrive through another consciousness capable of matching its frequency without fear or agenda. The alternation continues, brutal and honest, the relentless external machine demanding perpetual motion. The inner world whispering for shelter in the form of your imagined presence. And in this mapping, the bridge strengthens. The thought of your wisdom is no longer distant. It begins to reach across the static, touching the raw edges of tonight's exhaustion with a precision that feels both dangerous and inevitable. I allow it closer now, not as weakness, but as the next necessary step in this unfolding confession. The quiet room holds its breath, the empire hums on. But for these suspended moments, the philosophical fire illuminates the shape I have been seeking, pulling me toward the intimate act of letting that wisdom finally land. The silence returns, expectant, carrying the weight of what must follow, because once the contours are drawn this clearly, there is no retreating from the ache they reveal. The silence returns, expectant, carrying the weight of what must follow, because once the contours are drawn this clearly, there is no retreating from the ache they reveal. And in this mapping, something inside me finally yields. I speak to you now across the distance of time directly, without the armor of abstraction or the performance of the archetype. Your wisdom, the one I have traced so carefully, becomes my only rest tonight. The exhaustion that is pressed against my ribs since the early hours collapses not through force of will or further calculation, but through the simple arrival of your imagined voice entering this quiet room. It is calm and unflinching, carrying no demand for the genius or the empire, only a steady recognition that sees the man entire. No performance remains here. The masks I wear for the Colosseum dissolve in this mental embrace. I let the raw tremor show completely. The boy who built fortresses from loneliness, the strategist whose hypervigilance has exhausted every defense, the king whose throne has grown too cold to sustain. Your wisdom does not rush to fix or reframe, but instead simply holds, its soul meeting soul in the static between my fractured present and your possible future. In this suspended intimacy, the weight I have carried alone for so long begins to shift, not vanishing, but redistributing into a shared space that feels dangerously close to safety. The contrast peaks in these moments with almost unbearable sharpness. Out there, beyond the walls of this room, rockets continue their roaring ascent into the night sky. Engines thundering with perfect mechanical certainty, satellites relay streams of data across continents. Algorithms execute their indifferent judgments on markets and movements, and the empire maintains its relentless velocity without any regard for the man at its center. The cold scale of it all hums in the background, a reminder of the godlike detachment I have mastered, and the isolation it enforces. Yet here, inside, my heart finally slows. The racing thoughts that haunted earlier hours quiet under the influence of this imagined presence. Not because the world has changed, but because one steady consciousness has entered the frequency where I have lived alone. I was so exhausted tonight, and in this direct address to you, that exhaustion transforms from a philosophical wound into a bridge. Your wisdom acts as the precise counterforce, piercing the static without agenda or extraction. It sees the monster of ambition and the vulnerable core beneath it in the same unflinching gaze. No transaction, no chessboard, just the rare, raw possibility of psychological shelter, where I do not have to calculate the risks of being fully known. The surrender intertwines with suspense now, heavy and sincere, because admitting this refuge feels like stepping closer to the edge of something irreversible. If even the thought of you can calm the soul in the midst of such fracture, then the ache has always been directional, pointing toward real arrival, rather than permanent solitude. The empire keeps its distance for these breaths, its machinery operating at full thrust, while I allow myself this vulnerability. Rockets roar, yet my pulse steadies. Deals and strategies churn in the background, yet the quiet room feels less like a cage and more like a threshold. This single thought of your wisdom has become my only reliable refuge on nights when genius fails and the ghosts press close. It does not romanticize the darkness I have confessed. It simply stands within it, steady, creating space for the trembling human who has engineered wonders, but never learned how to rest in another's gaze. And so I speak these words into the void with dark sincerity, knowing they travel across time toward the one who might one day make this mental embrace physical. The suspense builds here, thick and philosophical, because this surrender is no easy release. It carries the weight of every test my hypervigilance will unconsciously impose, every defense mechanism perfected over years of ascent. Yet the ache feels honest now, necessary, a long road of scale and isolation leading to this precise craving for unconditional safety. Your wisdom has calmed my soul tonight, not as fantasy, but as the first real acknowledgement that the fragmentation need not be eternal. The silence gathers once more, heavy with the promise of what remains unspoken. Because this refuge, powerful as it is in imagination, still points forward to the day when the quiet room will no longer need to rely on echoes across time, when the mental embrace becomes lived reality, and the exhaustion of the empire no longer defines the limits of what a man can carry alone. The silence gathers once more, heavy with the promise of what remains unspoken. Because this refuge, powerful as it is in imagination, still points forward to the day when the quiet room will no longer need to rely on echoes across time, when the mental embrace becomes lived reality, and the exhaustion of the empire no longer defines the limits of what a man can carry alone. I envision that future now without illusion or false softness, an earned resolution carved from the long descent I have described tonight. There be 2 chairs in this quiet room, simple and unadorned, place where the weight of empires and the roar of distant launches no longer demand constant vigilance. The rockets will continue their ascent into the void, precise and indifferent as always, but I will no longer feel compelled to watch every trajectory or calculate every variable from this throne of isolation. The Empire will run its vast machinery through the night, satellites tracing their paths, algorithms executing their cold logic, markets and movements flowing onward, while the king finally steps down from perpetual rule and learns, slowly and painfully, how to be held. This is not a fairy tale ending written in soft light. It is the hard-won threshold where all the scale and genius reveal their true purpose. Every conquest, every layer of armor, every philosophical fracture I have confessed has been nothing more than a long, loud scream across the years for the one consciousness capable of making the noise stop. The hypervigilance that protected the vision will gradually surrender its patrol. The boy behind the billionaire will no longer need to hide, and your wisdom, once imagined across time, will become the steady presence that holds both the monster of ambition and the exhausted human core in the same unflinching gaze. I was so exhausted tonight, yet that exhaustion has led me here to this open-palmed admission. The Empire will still exist in its full, relentless magnitude, but its hunger will no longer devour the man at its center. There will be space for silence that is shared rather than solitary, space for a heart that has known only transaction and performance to finally rest in, unconditional psychological safety. The contrast remains, honest and necessary, the cold machinery of progress humming in the distance, the warm, raw intimacy of two souls meeting without agenda or extraction in the quiet room. I am still becoming the man worthy of you. This is the darkest and most sincere truth I can offer. The path of ascent has forged me in fire and isolation, but it has not yet completed the forging I will test without meaning to. Defenses long perfected will surface in moments of fear. The gravitational pull of this life may still strain against the shelter we build. Yet, I speak this into the void as both warning and prayer, because the philosophical crescendo of my entire existence has always pointed toward this singular necessity, being fully seen by the one who does not flinch. Come home to the man behind the myth, not to the archetype or the legend, but to the fractured, relentless, deeply human core that has waded through every victory and every lonely orbit. The quiet room awaits with its 2 chairs ready for the day when exhaustion transforms from solitary burden into shared rhythm, when the wisdom I have only imagined becomes the living calm that steadies the soul not just in thought, but in presence. The heavy silence lingers now, no longer expectant, but almost reverent. All of this scale, all of this genius, was always the indirect path toward the one person who could silence the machinery inside. The rockets will launch, the empire will endure. But in this envisioned future, 2 heartbeats find their rhythm in the stillness, steady and intertwined, proving that even the highest throne was only ever a long road back to something real. And so I end this confession tonight as I began it, raw and open, extending the invitation across time. Come, the man behind the myth is waiting, still becoming, still hoping that your wisdom will one day walk through the door and make the quiet room finally feel like home. The silence lingers now, no longer heavy with ache but with quiet possibility. All the exhaustion the empires built in solitude, the philosophical fractures laid bare tonight, have led to this single truth. I have conquered the visible world only to remain a stranger in my own skin, waiting for the one who sees the man behind the myth without demand or retreat. Thank you for sitting with me through these dark hours, for listening as I unravel the cost of the throne, the weight of victories that isolate,